Hey Tyler, remember when I told you about our distant relative Aunt Josephine and how she's actually dead?
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and I like showed you a note and everything to show you that she was like, "This is it. It's all over for me."
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
really sad.
I've got great news.
Oh,
She's not dead.
really?
Yeah. Oh, by the way, I've got bad news.
Okay.
She's gonna be dead real soon.
What?
Just thought I'd let you know, just to toy with your emotions. So,
Okay.
great news followed by bad news. So it just ends up exactly where it was before. But wonderful. Welcome to Woeful Wednesdays. Nathan reads a series of unfortunate events presented by Ignore the Tattoo. My name is Nathan.
And I'm Tyler.
So, this is a series in which I am reading through a series of unfortunate events for the first time. Tyler has read the series before. You read it at an appropriate age, as far as when the target demographic for these books.
Yeah.
I am far too old to be reading these for the first time. Some people might argue with that and say, no, you're not. That's perfectly fine. But I'm just saying, I wasn't the intended audience when he wrote this. So,
Yes. Yeah.
anyway, so what we're doing with this is we are producing one video a week, and we're breaking each book up into three different parts. So chapters 1 to 4, 5 to 8, and then 9 to 13. So for this week, we are looking at the middle chapters of the Wide Window, chapters 5 to 8. And so this is book the third.
hmm Yeah, the
Now,
wide window.
yeah. So we do have a sponsor for today's BookTube video. Our sponsor for today is the Anxious Clown Restaurant, where everybody has a good time, whether they like it or not. And listen, folks, their specialty is for grieving families. So if you do lose a close family member and you're upset, you know what your family member would want. They would want you to go there immediately to the Anxious Clown and order the cheer me up cheeseburgers, because they don't want you to grieve too long. You know, maybe like 5, 10 minutes of being inconsolable. But after that, they want you to just giggle at the delightful, whimsical, like there's a little smiley face on my cheeseburger, and then kind
Yeah.
of forget all about their life and the importance of it to you. That's
Yeah.
that's what
So
they
if
would want for you.
so if you're grieving, head
That's
on
right.
over to the anxious clown.
Exactly. It's a very specific group of diners that they're targeting with that ad. But,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I don't know. I'm not in marketing, so I can't tell you whether this is a good idea or not.
Yeah.
Anyway, I hope you enjoy, folks. Ignore the tattoo! Nathan unfortunately reads a series of unfortunate events at an unfortunate age, which in this case is being used to indicate that he is entirely too old to be reading this for the first time. Chapters 5 to 8 of The Wide Window, book the third. So I have got the plot summary duties for this week. So basically, where we pick up is that they believe that their Aunt Josephine, the Baudelaire children, believe that their Aunt Josephine is dead with the suicide note, but they're suspicious because it doesn't really make sense based off of the grammar, right? The grammatical errors, even though it's like, well, that's a punctuation error, not a
Right.
grammatical error, but okay. So in any case, uh, and they are supposed to now be put in the care of Captain Sham, who's really Count Olaf in disguise. And they contact Mr. Poe, who picks them up. They try to convince him that Captain Sham is actually Count Olaf and that the note has been forged. He has no patience for this, even if they're right or not. You don't accuse somebody of forgery. And so, anyway,
Yes.
they decide to go to the Anxious Clown restaurant to meet, because he calls up Captain Sham immediately and says, "Hey, do you want to be, a guardian, a foster parent, essentially, to these? I guess not even foster, because he's going to just straight up adopt them. Do you want to adopt these three children? This dude that he's never met before, whose name is Captain Sham." And he's like, "Oh, yeah, definitely. Let's sign the papers right now." And a banker is apparently allowed in this community. A banker is allowed to complete this kind of documentation. And so we'll talk about this. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
get through the plot summary here. So then they go to the restaurant, the Anxious Clown, and you know, of course, Mr. Poe cannot see through Captain Sham's disguise, and the kids, they need more time to figure out how to get out of this one. So what Violet does is she sees that she's got, what is it, like a pocket full of the peppermint candies. Yeah, and so then she very carefully unwraps three of these, and then passes one to Sunny and passes one to Klaus, and then they eat it because this was introduced in Act One. This is essentially the gun that was introduced in Act One that has to go off by Act Two. Of
Yep.
they've got this allergy to peppermint, and so then they take this, they break out in hives, and the tongue swells up, and all of this. I mean, Klaus's tongue swells up. Violet breaks out in hives, and Sunny, because she's never had peppermint before, gets both. Because
Right.
that's how allergies work in this community. So, um, anyway, I guess allergies are like a social construct here, not a biological thing. But in any case, so then they go back to Aunt Josephine's place, and Klaus is busy trying to figure out, he's looking through all the grammar books and ultimately decodes the letter, realizing that all of the misspellings that you get and the incorrect usages of words, um, then he deciphers this and figures out that it spells out curdled cave. And then they find an atlas, and then they're like, oh my goodness, Aunt Josephine gave us this coded message, which seems really clever for a woman obsessed with grammar. Like, do you know what I mean? It's fine. It's fine. But she's embedded this code into the supposed suicide note. They realize that they have to then go and find her because she's not dead. She's just somewhere in like curdled cave. And then ultimately, they decide to go, except lightning strikes the stilts of the house that is perched just on the edge of the cliff, hanging over Lake Lachrymose, and then it collapses into the lake. And plus, we've got a hurricane coming, as if that wasn't enough. Now there's a hurricane.
Yes, yeah, quite a bit of unfortunate events for these children.
Right. I think I covered everything, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah. So do you just want to hop into thoughts then?
Yeah,
Or,
let's do it. All right, so starting with chapter 5, I'll just get
Mhm.
back to the beginning of that. I don't have a lot with chapter 5. I think I've only got really 2 points that I wanted to mention with this. So
Okay.
the first one, this is on page 76 of my edition. And I just think that you get this really nice description here with the Venus flytrap plant being used as a metaphor here for what's happening with the Baudelaire children, but tying together the three books that we've had in the series so far, where it's not just saying, instead of this reading episodic, it's reading much more like a serial narrative where there's the
Mhm.
big story arc and saying all of this is fitting together instead of, oh, and then this is just another random thing that happened to them. So kind
Right.
of in the middle of that page, then it says, as the darkness of the house closed in around them, the Baudelaire youngsters felt like the fly in this situation. It was as if the disastrous fire that took the lives of their parents had been the beginning of a trap, and they hadn't even known it. They buzzed from place to place, Count Olaf's house in the city, Uncle Monty's home in the country, and now Aunt Josephine's house overlooking the lake, but their own misfortune always closed around them tighter and tighter, and it seemed to the three siblings that before too long they would dissolve away to nothing. And so, because first he gives the description of what a Venus flytrap is, in case somebody's unaware of this, but then, which I imagine a lot of children don't necessarily know, like, because I think a lot of kids see it in
Yeah.
cartoons and they think that these plants are enormous and they eat people. And it's like,
Right.
no, it's really for like insects. So
Yeah.
he gives a good description of it. And then, like I say, it ties together those three books where it doesn't
Hmm.
seem like, oh, well, Count Olaf had a really good plan that it just conveniently happened that he somehow heard about the fire at their family's house, that it seems like maybe there's more to it than just a random fire, that he's been kind of orchestrating and planning this long con against them, right? That it's
Hmm.
making it seem like it's a bigger plan than what we initially thought, because it seems in the first book, The Bad Beginning, that he's got the plan to take them in and then to just acquire their fortune. He's like, oh, this is not going to work. Okay, well, I'll marry her. I'll write this play so that way I can dupe Violet into marrying me. And then that doesn't work. And you're like, oh, That was plan A. And now he's moving on to plan B, which is, all right, I'll kill off Uncle Monty and take them to Peru and do something there. And now plan C is, all right, I'll pose as Captain Sham and then, kill off or at least put into hiding Aunt Josephine in order to be their new adopted parent. But this description is saying, no, 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 no. That plan A was like the weakest one, and then the stronger one, and then the stronger one.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
That it's like, that if it's a Venus flytrap, that initial snapping close, it's like, well, that's not going to kill the fly. It's going to take work to get up to it. So it seems like this is revealing a bit more about how deep Olaf's plans go.
Right. Yeah. That's a very interesting, observation there. And I hadn't worked it through that much, but yeah, particularly with the comment about them, dissolving away to nothing.
Yeah.
Then it's, it's all of these things just keep wearing them down a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more.
Yes.
Until eventually, something will work. And it's just,
exactly. Yeah. It's this cumulative effect where it's like, well, even if this doesn't work, but that had an impact, right? That it's not that like they return at 100% strength. It's that, well, now I got them down to like 95% strength or 90% strength. And ultimately, they're not going to be able to thwart every single one of my plans and tactics. That it's just, I'm getting them. That to me is what that passage does, which basically retextualizes the series, and it works better. Like it's a good turn that you get, because this is a series of unfortunate events, but it's not just, this is saying it's not repetitive, that this is ultimately adding up, and it's significant that thing happened, and then that thing happened, and then that thing happened, because this is like basically functioning as erosion.
Yeah, absolutely. All right.
So I had that, and then I guess I'll go over my last point with chapter 5, and then I want to hear yours. So it's right at the end of it, pages 80 to 81. Then it says that we just get a bit more here with I'll read that part. So it says, Mr. Poe couldn't think of anything else to say that might have comforted the Baudelaire orphans, but I wish now that I had the power to go back in time and speak to these 3 sobbing children. If I could tell the Baudelaires that, like earthquakes and puppet shows, their tears were occurring not only without warning, but without good reason. It's fun that puppet shows just occur without warning or reason.
Right.
The youngsters were crying, of course, because they thought Aunt Josephine was dead, and I wish I had the power to go back and tell them that they were wrong. But of course, I cannot. I am not on top of the hill overlooking Lake Lachrymose on that gloomy morning. I am sitting in my room in the middle of the night, writing down this story and looking out my window at the graveyard behind my home. I cannot tell the Baudelaire orphans that they are wrong, but I can tell you, as the orphans cry in Mr. Poe's arms, that Aunt Josephine is not dead. Not yet. Which is how we started this, because I'm saying, like, okay, don't worry, folks. Like, she's not dead, but she will be. You're like, well, she's not dead. Oh, she will be. Okay. But he's playing with his role as narrator here, Snicket is, of continuing to remind them that, like, I know what happens to these kids, but I'm not personally involved, and this took place in the past, so I'm helpless to do anything about it, but I care about them, and I wish that I could be more involved. But just Snicket acting as a character within this universe, it's another instance of that, and it's an interesting one.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really love any time that he inserts himself like that, and it is,
because he seems to care about them in this case, and not just, this, like, he's a ghoul where he just gets to say, this awful thing happened, isn't that funny, and this awful thing happened, right? But instead he's like, it seems a little bit more like, Oh, it's unfortunate because a lot of times when he's describing
Yeah.
these things, even though he says it's unfortunate, it's in such a facetious way that
Mhm.
he doesn't feel bad. But in this case, he's like, I wish I could be there. I wish I could comfort them. Um,
Right. Yeah, yeah, and it does. Yeah, because of course he says multiple times that it is his, at the very least in the letters to the editor, to his editor. Then he says, like it is my solemn duty, and it's like,
yes,
well, like why? What is
right.
it that compels you to do this? And yeah, I think that that is uh, probably the first, instance that we get where he's really saying like that it's because he cares about these children that he wants to, tell their story.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and just kind of like my final point with that, it's a funny thing because there's still even humor embedded in that where he's saying, I want to comfort them to tell them that their aunt's not dead. And then he's like, not
Mhm.
yet. And it's like, how the hell would that comfort them?
Right.
Right? They're
Yeah.
grieving their mourning, and it's like, well, she's not dead. It's like, oh, good. And then it's like, but she will be very soon. Then it's like, you might as well not tell them at all.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I only had one point for this whole chapter, which was just on page 79. And it is I just really love this moment where the main paragraph there. Violet opened the peeling white door, and there stood Mr. Poe in the gloomy light of dawn. Mr. Poe, Violet said. She intended to tell him immediately of their forgery theory, but as soon as she saw him standing in the doorway with a white handkerchief in one hand and a black briefcase in the other, her words stuck in her throat. Tears are curious things, for like earthquakes or puppet shows, they can occur at any time, without any warning, and without any good reason. Mr. Poe, Violet said again, and without any warning, she and her siblings burst into tears. Violet cried, her shoulders shaking with sobs, and Klaus cried, the tears making his glasses slip down his nose, and Sunny cried, her open mouth revealing her 4 teeth. Mr. Poe put down his briefcase and put away his handkerchief. He was not very good at comforting people, but he put his arms around the children the best he could and murmured, there, which is a phrase some people murmur to comfort other people, despite the fact that it doesn't really mean anything. Uh, I just think that that is such a great example of what we had kind of talked about before with sincerity
Yes.
when talking about uh, the children's misfortune and their grief. Um, I think that it reads so genuine, and in that moment, you also get as much as it is, a joke about there not meaning anything, that
Right.
it's then you're getting that Mr. Poe actually does care for them. Like he is kind-hearted, but he doesn't know what to do, which I think is a pretty good general statement for Mr. Poe, where
Yeah,
he wants the best for them, but he has no idea what he's doing.
absolutely.
um, so yeah, that was my only moment for chapter 5 because I just
Yeah,
think that's a lovely passage.
it is. It is. And I mean, it's an interesting point that he makes about how, tears can all of a sudden, uh,
Yeah.
tears are curious things for like earthquakes or puppet shows. They can occur at any time without any warning and without any good reason. It's
Mhm.
that is true up until a point. So it's like at any time, yes, without warning, yes, especially if somebody's grieving, then
Yeah.
tears can come without warning, um, and without any good reason. It's like no, but
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that. It is an odd inclusion there, and it's I think purely there for the payoff on the next page, where
yes,
he says that the children were crying for no good reason. But yeah,
yeah, it's one of the. I feel like he can't help himself there.
yeah,
He's
yeah,
like, this is too sincere. I got to throw in a little joke here,
right,
a
yeah,
little like non sequitur or something.
yeah, yeah, and same with the puppet show mention, which is just
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah. All right, that's good. So, why don't you go first with chapter 6?
Sure. All right, so my first note is on page 84. Um, toward the middle of the page. Um, yeah. Remember when you lived with Uncle Monty? You were convinced that his assistant Stefano was really Count Olaf in disguise. But Stefano was Count Olaf in disguise, Klaus exclaimed. That's not the point, Mr. Poe said. The point is that you can't jump to conclusions. It's like, what?
Yeah, I know. I've got that marked as well. And just as a, like, that's funny.
Yeah, it's so funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, so on page, my next note is on page 87. Um, let me see. Yes, and I really like the turn here, and I know that you were convinced that, of course, Count Olaf must have written the note, and
Yes,
that's
I
why there were all
was.
those
Yeah.
grammatical errors. But yeah, the this moment, actually starting on page 86, just that last paragraph there. Yes, there are some questions that are so simple that anyone can answer them, and Mr. Poe and the Baudelaire orphans instantly knew the answer to the question, does the handwriting on the shopping list match the handwriting on the note? The answer was yes. And it's just like, oh, like you would think that that would immediately go to the answer was no, of course it didn't match. But
Right.
it's a nice turn there. And the fact that he, kind of delays that, and even, prior to that, describing graphologists and everything like that, then it seems like, oh
Yes.
yeah, this is going to be, so simple that of course nobody needs to look at nothing like her thing. Um, but yeah, I just think that's a very well done turn. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I don't think that's quite the turn there.
Mm,
To me, it's not, because to me, I looked at that and I'm like, oh, so did like Olaf then also, like, he saw the shopping list and then he just rewrote it in his own hand, thinking that
mm,
that would then corroborate the fact that it is her handwriting.
gotcha.
And it's not until later that you see that it spells out something. But
Right.
that was just me. But I do think it is. It's a. It makes more sense. It works better because, remember, my criticism was, but Olaf is not this bad of a writer,
Yeah.
so it didn't make sense to me that it just
Yeah.
seems so inconsistent. So I'm like, oh,
And
okay, that's good. It holds up
yeah, I
better.
was I was struggling so much to not say
Yeah.
that
Everyone
during
gets to laugh at me because you've all read it before and I haven't read it. You all get to be smug. Just a
No,
reminder, smugness is not a good quality, people.
yeah, no, I think that all of us were in that position the first time that we read through this, though.
Right.
Like, of
Right.
course, Count Olaf wrote it, and yeah, it does seem a little odd that he would make that many errors, but yeah, no, it's a nice little I don't even want to say twist, but it is, yeah, a turn, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Did you have anything
Well,
else for chapter 6?
no, I believe that was it. Yeah.
Okay, so I've just got two of them here. So on page 85,
Mm,
this is Mr. Poe. So towards the top,
mm,
then it says, just from like that paragraph where it says Mr. Poe smiled. So Mr. Poe smiled. You see, you're very intelligent children, but even the most intelligent people in the world often need the help of a banker. Now, where can we find a sample of Aunt Josephine's handwriting, right? And I just put, that's just what the banking industry wants you to think. You know, you might be
Yeah.
very intelligent, but you absolutely need to listen to us. And like whatever we tell you is best for you and your personal finances, we've got your best interest in heart. We're not making money off of interest and everything else. You're not going to pay double the purchase price of your home on your mortgage, and we're going to collect the other half as interest. Like, you're a very intelligent person, but trust us, we know what we're doing, and it's in your best interest. Like that banking industry,
Yeah.
the true
Yeah.
villains of this story.
Right. Absolutely. But yeah, no, I do really like that moment. I did laugh out loud when I was reading that because it was just like, you would think that he would say the help of another or of a friend
Sure.
or
No,
something. But no,
a
the help of a
banker.
banker. Everyone needs the help of a banker at some point.
Yeah, I'm
All
telling you,
right.
it's propaganda that they've been advertising to us for the past 100 years. Um, anyway, and then the last one I had for chapter 6 is on page 93. Then this is Violet kind of giving examples of things that you can invent. She says, but you can't invent things like time. This is the last paragraph on that page. But you can't invent things like time, Violet said. You can invent things like automatic popcorn poppers. You can invent things like steam powered window washers, but you can't invent more time. And so I just put a little note here that this is another example of this being a neo-Victorian setting, right? Where it's not steampunk, but steampunk is neo-Victorian, right? Where
Right.
it's pre-gasoline and electricity, but a lot of steam-powered devices and that whole aesthetic that, I mean, think about this. You can invent things like automatic popcorn poppers. Okay, sure, you can invent that. You can invent things like steam powered window washers. Steam powered window washer?
Right.
Steam power? We're really going to use steam power? Steam power, like one of the most inefficient, forms of, power, right? Because gasoline is far superior to steam, and like
Yeah.
yeah. So anyway, I just thought it's interesting because these books are in this curious little um, a curious setting that is inconsistent as far as technology
Yeah.
and yeah, everything else, because like there's no mention of computers. I don't know if
Right.
you
Yeah.
noticed that, but they've
Yeah.
got automobiles, but I haven't noticed a single instance of a mention of a computer. So it's almost like they're living in this analog world, but also mentioning
Mhm.
things like steam power and
Yeah. I wonder how much of that is because of this being written for children and in an older style, right?
yes,
That it's supposed to almost be, for children, then it's like, oh yeah, it was a really, really long time ago,
right.
like just before you were born.
Like maybe the 1980s.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, they're like, ooh, the 1980s.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, but yeah, anyway, that just contributes to that aesthetic that you have.
Yeah.
All right. So that's all I had with chapter 6. So I guess I'll go first with chapter 7.
Okay.
I've only really got one note for chapter 7. So this is on page 102. Then at first you get this funny little line here. So this the first full paragraph on page 102. If you're allergic to a thing, it is best not to put that thing in your mouth, particularly if that thing is cats. I'm like, that's good. That's a good little turn because you get that little twist. He's got the setup for a joke. You know it's going to come, and you're like, well, and you maybe don't even know that it's going to be a joke, but it's like, right, yeah. If you're allergic to a thing, you better not put it in your mouth. And then
Yeah.
particularly if the thing is, and then fill in the blank, and then
Yeah.
you're like, okay, where's he going with this? And then it's just such a bizarre non sequitur of it does not follow, especially if the thing is cats. Like,
Right.
okay. So
Good
there,
advice.
yeah, like there's not anything to it beyond the fact that it's just like that's an odd little thing to mention, like an odd particularity to point out, but it's
Yeah.
funny. But then it continues on. But Violet, Klaus, and Sunny all knew that this was an emergency. They needed time alone to figure out Captain Sham's plan and how to stop it. And although causing allergic reactions is a rather drastic way of getting time by yourself, it was the only thing that they could think of. So while neither of the adults at the table were watching, all three children put the peppermints into their mouths and waited. And then the Baudelaire allergies are famous for being quick acting, so the orphans did not have long to wait. And then you get that whole interesting thing of, you know, Klaus has the swollen tongue, Violet gets the hives, and then Sunny gets both. And I just put in here, which I had already mentioned, but basically, I thought it's the idea of if you introduce a gun in Act One, it better go off by Act Two, right?
Mhm.
Am I remembering this right, or is it by Act Three?
Um, yeah, I don't remember which it is, but yeah, it's one or the other. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's an interesting thing because occasionally he's introducing different things that seem random. And
Hmm.
of course, like it, good writing advice for at least sincere literature is everything in your story has to have a purpose. So every single
Right.
thing that you put in the story has to contribute to plot, to character, to theme, to setting. And if it's really not contributing to any of those things, then it's extraneous to the story and it should be just omitted or extracted from the story. You need to cut it out when you're doing your editing and revisions. But if, for in his case, if it has some kind of comedic effect because these are facetious like books, then it's fine to leave it in there even if it doesn't come up later on. So he's kind of
Yeah.
throwing you off because you're not always suspicious about everything that he introduces early on, because you're like, is that
Yeah.
just in there because it was a convenient end to a joke, right? This
Yeah.
idea of like, oh, she offered us peppermints and of course we're allergic to peppermints, and you're like, okay, like, why
Right.
not? um
Yeah.
but then
Um,
there is a payoff in this case.
yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, it is. Because, for example, in the reptile room, then we get, just thinking of, an example off the top of my head, then we get the description of all the different kinds of creatures that are in the reptile room.
Yes,
And none of them have anything to do with the story later on. Like, it's just like, oh yeah, okay, there's a frog with wings or whatever. Like, and it's just completely there for the one-off joke. And
that's what
so,
I'm saying. But
yeah,
he could have reintroduced those, and then you look back and you go,
absolutely.
oh, that was clever. You like a
Yeah.
murder mystery, right? That you introduced that clue earlier in the story, but in doesn't even have to be a murder mystery, but in any kind of mystery, the rules are that you have to introduce it earlier, so that way it's fair for a discerning reader to be able to then pick up on that and then be able to solve it before the detective solves it,
Hmm.
right? And
Yeah.
so in this case, he's kind of playing by the rules, but at the same time, because you have that comedic element, he can play a little fast and loose with them. So sometimes
Yeah.
it's there just for comedic effect, but other times it is significant and it will come back later on. So, because you're exactly right, in the reptile room, you have the same thing. He introduces all of these things that sound really dangerous, but then they don't get reintroduced.
Yeah.
So, not at least not all of them. A couple of them sort of do. But
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. All right. So, those were all your thoughts for chapter 7.
yep.
All right. So I also just wanted to note on page 99, then we do get around the middle of that page, Mr. Poe. Well, you will be caring for them, yes, Mr. Poe said. Of course, the Baudelaire fortune will still be under my supervision until Violet comes of age. What fortune? Captain Sham asked, his eyebrow curling. I don't know anything about a fortune. I think that that's just really, really well done to, again, establish that Olaf isn't completely idiotic, that he's able to play this part fairly well of,
Yeah.
oh, I don't know anything about a fortune.
Right.
um,
Yeah.
yeah, I just think that that's a nice little moment there. Um, and then on page 105, the last paragraph there. Um, but even so, the three children were eager to leave the anxious clown, and not just because the garish restaurant, the word garish here means filled with balloons, neon lights, and obnoxious waiters, was filled with balloons, neon lights, and obnoxious waiters.
Right. Right.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yes. Yeah, because the redundancy there is funny. And
Yeah.
like from a comedy writing perspective, then typically if you do that, then you're expecting some kind of non sequitur to follow as the punchline,
Mhm.
like what you had before with like, if you're allergic to something, it's best not to put it in your mouth, especially if it's, or particularly if it's cats, right?
Yep.
But like this is, best not to put it in your mouth, particularly if it's peppermints that cause you to break out in hives and your tongue will swell up. It's exactly what he had just said.
Yeah.
That repetition, that redundancy ends up being funny too, because he's switching it up often enough that every time you have this expectation of how he's going to conclude, what he's going to use as a punchline, then he uses a different type of joke.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I like about these books so much.
Yeah,
One of the
they're
things.
right. I
Yeah,
am impressed with that part because I thought because earlier just everything to me was being telegraphed, but now as he
yeah,
gets to subvert much more of his own the rules that he's already established, then it's like, okay, now you're keeping the reader on their toes a lot more, which is
yeah,
satisfying.
yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
Why don't you go first with chapter 8?
sure. All right, so top of page 108. Um, let me see where it was. Oh, yes. I just wanted to note. Uh, okay, so Klaus's tongue is swollen up. So Violet says, "Never mind, never mind." Violet said, opening the door and ushering her siblings inside. Now you have the time that you need to figure out whatever it is that you're figuring out. Blah blah blah. Klaus blood.
Yes, I like that dialogue tag, Klaus Blood.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, and we get like a few more, things like that where he's like, "I think this is what Sonny meant," and
Right.
all that, which, yeah, just kind of a little bit of fun there.
Yes.
Um, Next note was on page 112. Um, uh, yeah, we get more of that. Yeah, just about the blood, but of course now it's starting to wear off a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, and I did want to note that I really think that he goes too long with describing every single error in the note.
Mm,
Um, that I mean, like it makes sense from a story standpoint, but at the same time, I'm just like, okay, maybe you leave like a few little things for children to like go back and look. Okay, well, which was wrong, and how was it wrong?
right.
Um, I just think that that would have been kind of nice, but other than that, then yeah, that was. Oh, and then I had one more note on page 126, um, which is yeah, just Lemony Snicket's full description of all the amazing things he has seen in his long and troubled life history. I have seen a series of corridors built entirely out of human skulls. I have seen a volcano erupt and send a wall of lava crawling toward a small village. I have seen a woman I loved picked up by an enormous eagle and flown to its high mountain nest. But I still cannot imagine what it was like to watch Aunt Josephine's house topple into Lake Lachrymose. My own research tells me that the children watched in mute amazement as the peeling white door slammed shut and began to crumple as you might crumple a piece of paper into a ball. I have been told that the children hugged each other even more tightly as they heard the rough and ear-splitting noise of their home breaking loose from the side of the hill. But I cannot tell you how it felt to watch the whole building fall down, 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 and hit the dark and stormy waters of the lake below. Um, so my main note about this is just that he's really emphasizing that this is his own research and that it could be that it could be wrong. And I mean, he's referenced his research before, but I feel like there's multiple instances in this one paragraph where he's saying like, as far as I can tell, as far as my research has led me. And I just think that's really interesting to, I guess, reestablish how unreliable of a narrator he is, even though he has done all of this research. So, yeah. Oh, I think your mic is off.
Oh, sorry, I turned it off because I had a helicopter going overhead.
Oh,
Um, and so, yes, it's. Oh, now it's coming back. Anyway, you guys get some fun background noise. So, on the one hand, he is establishing that he's an unreliable narrator here, but I've got this passage marked as well because it's such a peculiar thing that he's doing, because he's now inserting all of this doubt over his reliability as a narrator in the story. Because
hmm
prior to this, I mean, and this is really why this is at least my theory of why a narrator as a character in the story um, or a narrator as persona who's speaking directly to children or directly to the reader, why I think this has gone out of vogue, out of fashion in literature, is because of issues like this. It then causes the reader to question, how do you know what you know? And then that, to me, ends up ruining the suspension of disbelief. That there's no, because you can kind of follow along in a story and you're just getting the story and you're believing that's what the character said, this is what happened, this is how it played out. But then when you start getting the I think and I have reason to believe, and from this, and you're going, well, how do I know what to trust and what not to trust? And if the unreliable narrator is the effect that you're going for, then that's fine. But unreliable narrators typically work best when it's a first person story, when the character's telling their own story. But this is third person narration. And so it's such a strange thing, because like, just even like jumping back, this is just a random thing, but jumping back to like, you know, the previous page, on page like 124, then it says just in the middle of the page, Tafka, Sonny shrieked, which meant we have to get out of here right now. Well, how did his research reveal that Tafka is what Sonny said, and that it meant we have to get out of here right now? Like, everything. He's got all these little details as though he has been observing them so closely. And then he's saying, no, I'm totally distant from the story. I wasn't there. I don't know for sure what they were feeling or thinking. It's like, but you knew what they were thinking and feeling all the way up until now. And now you're inserting all of this doubt. And I don't know why he's doing it.
Right. Yeah. I agree. I think that it is a little odd. It's more than a little odd. But yeah, it's just the way that I see it, I suppose, is that he has written a series based on the all of his research about the Baudelaire orphans. But it is then, well, yeah, what is, what actually happened and what didn't. And it's partly a way of, I think, excusing any inconsistencies that may come up. But I'm not saying that's good. I'm just saying, like, I think that's part of it. And it's just also, I don't know.
But it's reminding the reader, though, because that works, as a way of excusing inconsistencies, functions if you're writing nonfiction. But there's typically just a note at the beginning of a nonfiction book that will say, all of the dialogue in here is to the best of my recollection, but of course errors and omissions are going to exist because I wasn't documenting it perfectly. But you just go with it as you're reading it. It's not exactly what they said, and maybe some of it is and some of it isn't, but you don't want the narrator of that story, you don't want the writer to constantly remind you, especially in the middle. This is the middle of the book, to say, listen, I can't remember exactly what this person said or what they were thinking or feeling, so I probably screwed it up. And then you're like, I was totally into the story, and now you're pulling me out of the story. And that's why I'm saying that I think narrators have become more and more effaced, right? And what that means is, effaced is, just in case anybody's unfamiliar with the English term, it comes from the French effacer, which means to erase. And so narrators are, even when you have a third person narrator in most stories now, they don't remind the reader that they are a narrator and they are narrating a story to you. They don't speak to them. They try to be invisible, like to be erased from the story, to be as invisible as possible. He is inserting himself into the story frequently, and that works with funny little asides. But then to throw all of this doubt into the story just seems so peculiar that I don't understand. I mean, I guess his effect, what he's trying to achieve, is to indicate that he doesn't know how to show the depth of their sadness in this moment, to say, I can't even imagine how upsetting that was for them. So you can imagine that it was really, really upsetting. But I feel like there's better ways to do it than to say, like, my research failed me in this moment. Like,
no, I agree.
If I were an editor with this book and I had that as a manuscript, then I would press him on that. You know what I mean? An editor is not going to necessarily like it's still ultimately the author's decision, especially if you're with a good publisher. But I think that it's absolutely something that if that was not a discussion, then that to me is a failure on the editor's part. Unless they have more insight into this than I have, because I don't get it other than, it just seems so peculiar.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, so that was my only, those were my only notes for chapter 8.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm remembering now, and I don't remember where it was. I guess I did not mark it. But there's one point, and it actually kind of bothered me, where um, uh, Klaus says that he oh, what is it? He says that we now know what Aunt Josephine meant by curdled cave. And then right on the next page, and he says, but we don't know what Aunt Josephine meant by curdled cave. And I went, what? um, so yeah, it's uh, yeah. I think it's here on page 115. Klaus smiled and showed his sisters the 2 words he had written on the bottom of the note. Curdled cave, he read out loud. Curdled Veek, Sonny asked, which meant curdled what? Curdled cave, Klaus repeated. If you take all the letters involved in the grammatical mistakes, that's what it spells. And then he goes on. He said, and then at the end of that paragraph, Aunt Josephine knew she was making grammatical errors, and she knew we'd spot them. She was leaving us a message, and the message is curdled. And then they get interrupted. Page 117. Man, I know that it's like it was here.
What is it that you're trying to find?
It was a moment of inconsistency where, oh yes, here, 117. Then Klaus says, but I need to go back in there, Klaus said, holding up the note. We just found out what Aunt Josephine means by curdled cave, and we need a library to find out more. And then on the next page, then Klaus says, you've been so busy, or Violet says, you've been so busy figuring out the message, Violet said, that you don't understand what it means. It's like, so does he know what it means or does he not? Because it just seems, because he says, we just found out what Aunt Josephine means by curdled cave.
Mm.
He doesn't say, oh, we just found out that Aunt Josephine wanted us to know curdled cave and we need to find out what it means.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it was just a moment that stuck out to me that I was like, oh, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah. It's an interesting moment. I like the idea. I like what he's doing here with having the hidden message in there, and then Klaus figures it out. And yeah, but I do see what you mean. There's not good communication between Violet and Klaus. And it's like there's a communication breakdown the way there is when they're talking to Mr. Poe, where they're kind of talking past each other, that he's trying to tell her all about Curdled Cave, and we got to get a library. And then she's like, but what does Curdled Cave mean? And the other note that I have, and it does deal with this, is on page 122. And it just says, so I guess I'll start with the second paragraph on that page. This book is 478 pages long, Klaus exclaimed, looking at the last page of the atlas, because like Violet tells him, we'll use an atlas because it's got to be a geographical place. It'll take forever to find Curdled Cave. We don't have forever, Violet said. Captain Sham is probably on his way here now. Use the index in the back, look under Curdled. Klaus flipped to the index, which I'm sure you know is an alphabetical list of each thing a book contains and what page it's on. And then so then it shows him very intentionally trying to use an index. I can tell you this for sure, that the amount of times that I've had to teach children, like especially middle grade especially, what an index is, how it functions, like often they're like, whoa, I didn't know books had this thing that you could
Right.
find something. You're like, this is so helpful because it looks so boring, even if you flip to the
Yeah.
back and it just looks like meaningless stuff. That the first time you discover an index, it does kind of open up all of these possibilities of what difficult text can offer you as far as finding information.
Yeah.
So this is another instance of the books being written in a didactic way, of this instructional thing of how to even read books, and the value of books that
Yeah.
I think Handler is embedding into these stories. And at the same time, it's kind of interesting that Klaus, who's supposed to be the expert reader,
Right.
doesn't know what the hell an index is, but Violet does. He's going, this book is 478 pages long, Klaus exclaimed, looking at the last page of the atlas. It'll take forever to find Curdled Cave. If he is supposed to be this expert reader who just everything about him is he loves books, he reads, and Violet reads, but she reads engineering books. Maybe that's why she understands what an index is, but he doesn't. But he's never encountered an index before.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there are certainly some moments within this chapter where the dialogue should have been flipped, where it should have been
Yeah,
Violet who said
right.
things that Klaus said, and Klaus should have said things that Violet said. And I don't know, how that got past the editor or whatever, but it's just,
Do
yeah.
they have unique voices?
uh, Not really, no.
Right. And that's the thing. And I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm genuinely not, but I'm saying
Mhm.
uh, as a way of examining literature, one of the things that you should do if you're looking at characters, especially if you're a writer, then what you want to do is you you know that you have written original characters if they have an original voice. If
Yeah.
you take a line of dialogue from one of your characters and then you get a different character to say that line of dialogue, if it functions, if you've got a group of people and it's like any one of these 3 or 4 people in the group could say this line and it would make perfect sense the way it's written right now, then you probably don't have original voices for
Yeah.
characters. And Klaus and Violet, like their characteristics are so generic at this point. It's just Klaus is a reader. He loves books. Violet loves engineering. She loves mechanical things.
Yeah.
But that's basically it. They don't really have catchphrases or interesting turns of phrases that one will use and the other one won't, or sass or attitude.
Right.
They
Other than
just seem
Klaus saying,
we
"We
know.
know."
Like it should have been, I know what an index is,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
anyway, it's not bad, but it's not great.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not great that in this chapter, as you point out, it seems like the dialogue should be flipped, and it should be, but the fact that it's not just this super obvious thing of that's Klaus's voice, that's Violet's voice, that you start realizing, oh, they don't really have a voice.
Right. Yeah.
They just have content to what they're saying, but not
Yeah.
a certain rhythm to their a certain form of syntax that they employ when they're speaking. Um,
Mhm.
it's it's not a big deal because I don't think that's the purpose of these books,
Right.
but it is one of those things that I think, as even with a finished book, and I guess this would be my point, even with a finished book and a bestseller, I think there's still places where it could be tightened.
Yeah. 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 No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm good with these chapters. If you're good, I'm ready to move on to
Yeah.
last 5.
Yeah. Let's see how they can, potentially get to Aunt Josephine,
Right.
uh, and
I'm
avoid
very
being under the care of Captain Sham.
right. I am very curious about this because both the bad beginning and the reptile room, it seemed he was kind of telegraphing where it was going. It was pretty unsurprising. But with
Mhm.
this one, I'm like, I this is a twist that I was not expecting, that she's still alive, that she's
Yeah.
in Turtle Cave, that there was this embedded message and that they deciphered it and that they're on their own. Because it's a bit tiresome where they can't do anything because Count Olaf is there. They can't do anything because he's there. Like, that's a tiresome plot device of just we're frustrated because he's threatening us and he's right there. But this whole free them up, let them try to figure out how to do this stuff on their own, see if they can solve this mystery, I think works better. So yeah, I'm curious how this ends.
Yeah. No, it's I'm very curious as to your thoughts on the last 5 chapters.
All right, well, I'll start reading. All right, folks, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
Ignore the tattoo! A phrase here which means like, comment, subscribe, and share this podcast across the web. That may seem like a strange definition, but in this context, it is entirely accurate.